Good evening, everyone. My name is Danny Diaz, and I am the director of the UCLA History Geography Project at UCLA Center X. On behalf of the team, we are thrilled that you all are joining us and are beyond excited to share our conception of what project-based learning can look like when we center justice, equity, and criticality. In the chat, please take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone by letting us know, 1, your name, 2, your role in education, and 3, if you would like, where you currently work. Traditionally speaking, project-based learning, or PBL, is a learning framework that asks students to explore a single topic through the lens of multiple classes. In this way, it is cross-disciplinary. At the end of a PBL research cycle, students will produce an answer to the question that drove their course exploration and usually present this to their fellow students, their teachers, or even their community. We believe that the PBL framework can be and should be used to help students explore issues related to justice and equity. Throughout this webinar, we will explore how our particular content areas can be used to achieve this. This webinar really represents our ideas using a real-world example and our collective expertise in the fields of science education, math education, history education, ethnic studies, and design-based learning. I'm now going to pass the mic to my colleague, John Kovac.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Kovac, and I am the director of the UCLA Science Project. As a land-grant institution, our webinar team from UCLA Center X acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. If you'd like to know more about Indigenous territories in which you reside and work, please visit Native Land, California, at the link in the chat that Jen from the Mathematics Project has placed for you. And it's my pleasure to, and now before we begin, we're gonna talk a little bit about the structure of today in our short time together and a possible resource to support your thinking. As Jen will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to post any questions or comments you might have, and we'll try to address as many as possible. This is not going to follow a typical webinar structure, so you'll have the opportunities today to interact with the content and each other in breakout rooms. And to support your thinking, we'd like to offer a few guiding participation norms below. As you take a look at these bullet points, take a moment to look these over and think about which one you'd like to remain high in your consciousness as you engage in dialogue in your breakout rooms. And one final resource for today's learning is a hyperdoc, which you'll find a link for in the chat. On this hyperdoc, you'll find today's focus questions and outcomes for our session. Our focus question, you'll be able to explore today, is how do I make sure that my identity does not come at the expense of someone's dignity? The outcomes that hopefully you'll walk away with are a shared understanding of the importance of storytelling and student voice in creating learning experiences, as well as possible strategies to increase student agency and center content and their lived experiences. In this hyperdoc, you'll find some areas to record your thinking, some possible reflection questions, and some other resources you'll see later in this presentation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Cindy from the UCLA History Geography.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we get too far into it, we thought this would be a good time for you all to meet the team. So this webinar is being presented by Center X. Our Center X name captures both the intersection of research and practice, as well as our roots as an activist community. Together, we work to transform public schooling to create a more just, equitable, and humane society. Specifically, this webinar is a collaboration between the History Project, the Science Project, our Design-Based Learning Project, and our Mathematics Project. For your convenience, our team will be pinned so that you can match our Bitmojis to our faces.
Thank you very much, Cindy. So to kick off our webinar, I want to frame our worked example of critical professional-based learning by asking you a question about identity. So specifically, I want you to think about your family, your culture, and your food traditions. We want you to think about those three things through a prompt that is going to show up on the screen right here. So again, think about your family, your culture, and your food traditions, and think about what food makes you, you. And please, in the chat, share a food that you connect deeply with your identity, your culture, your family, your food traditions. So what we're going to do right now is transition into breakout groups. And in the breakout room, you're going to have a chance to not only share about the food that makes you, you, but also introduce yourselves to one another. So feel free to use the entire time of this breakout group and allow Zoom to bring you back if you want to use the entire period of this breakout room session. We're going to plan for this to run 6 to 8 minutes. And again, we're going to share a little bit about yourselves, but specifically answer this question: what food makes me, me?
Yeah, I think the recommendation, was to think about how food, where we started, was to use that as an access point to potentially, or entry point to hopefully come up and start a place to investigate an answer to that question. Not that any of us would come up with it in the next, minutes, but and that the origins came from the researcher Matt Garcia, if I got that name right.
Oh yeah, no, that's him. Matt Garcia.
But I was thinking about Kraft macaroni and cheese being essential to why I'm alive, because I was such a picky eater. It was the only thing I would eat. And being like, what do I investigate? What's that dust made out of that goes on all the noodles? Maybe.
The dust. I like that. It's that you call it dust.
So I missed the beginning, so I have no context except for the storytelling, but what I'm about to say, except for Lorena's story. But the thing that struck me in terms of identity as a middle class, educated suburban woman, I'll describe myself as like that for the purpose of this conversation. And when I think about my identity in relationships to Lorena's dignity in particular, is I pay $5 a container for blueberries. And Lorena makes, however, I forgot how much it was that she made. And that my lifestyle affords me an opportunity to go to Whole Foods and do this. But what would it look like if I went and bought my produce closer to the source? And I know that I don't know, that's just something that I took away from it. But I agree, Stephen, I totally understand your question. I'm not really sure where it's going, but it did provoke that in me.
Well, I love what you said, Anna Marie, and it's like you were predicting where I'm going, because I'm all about the mathematics and using that as a tool to process this question of how we how our practices impact others, right? The choices that we make about where we shop, what we buy, we don't always think about how that fee of what we pay for something goes to support workers who allow for that. And I think that question, Stephen, for me is thinking about, I'm always looking for sales. I'm looking for a good deal. I'm looking for a way to be able to make my dollars stretch. But how do those companies and producers and farm growers, how do they make sure that they take care of their farm workers to be able to have that margin? And where is that margin coming from? Is it Lorena who's renting the weight of that margin, or is it the company or the farm grower who is? So it immediately makes me think about that. Jenny, what about you?
Hi, sorry, I have my husband here. So who's joining, but he can't hear you. He can see you. Yeah, I mean, I think similarly to you, Anna Marie, I thought about the choices. So like one of the staples, if I had to link to my own personal food story, would be rice, and to think about rice and rice workers, and where does rice come from, and the labor that's intensive labor that's involved in that. Yeah, going back though to the question about identity and then someone else's dignity, is I think about, when you think about, like, I try to be a conscious consumer, like to what you're saying, Kristine, and then how do you, if that margin is paid by like Lorena and not, right? So does that mean you don't shop at Whole Foods? Does that mean you shop somewhere else? Like, and then because where is that, and how do we help? So that's an interesting question. Like that would be it's a really involved. I mean, I just think about that in our standardized testing conversation. Like here, I'm in Massachusetts, right? So we had just a lot of teachers who were conscientious objectors. Who do you do that at the moment where you say you're not going to administer a standardized test? Do you go to this? Do you go to this? The Department of Ed for the state? Do you go to, like, where is that chain? So that to me would be is a puzzle if I think about this with students. So then I think about, because where would I go, right? If I think about my Blueberry money, yeah, if not Whole Foods, if I don't know, right, do I spend the time to know where my food comes from for all choices, right? Yeah.
Well, that makes me think about conscious consumers. Like we are conscious about the things that we are made aware of, and what we consume is oftentimes dictated by special interests, which makes folks like Lorena invisible. And so, like you said, Jenny, I consider myself a conscious consumer too, but I can tell you right now, there are things in my cabinet I shouldn't be eating. There are things, this blouse I'm wearing, probably, for all I know, it was made by child laborers in some other country, or even in my own backyard. I don't know, because it's not been out there for my consumption. Like I have also, well, this is interesting too, because as educated people, we can find information if we choose to find it. But the public in general, they have what's in front of them. And that's why I think it's really important for us to have our students engaged in critical media literacy, because it helps them to be more critical consumers of what's out there.
So,
And welcome back, everyone. We hope you all had a chance to share in your breakout groups and get a chance to meet one another a little bit as well. We have folks from all over the country, which is really cool. So I asked this question earlier mistakenly, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it again now that we had a chance to talk. In the chat, if you could, please let us know what the food is that you identified as making you you. If you could go ahead and drop it in the chat, that'd be great. Okay, so I see dumplings, tortillas, that was mine. Government cheese, tamales, dango, holiday meatballs. I'm reading as quick as I can. Pizza, these are terrific. Thank you so much, and continue to share, please. As you continue to share, just give me a couple of minutes to I want to take a couple of minutes to contextualize this worked example of a critical approach to project-based learning. So the genesis of this idea comes from a workshop that the UCLA History Geography Project and the UCLA Public History Institute put on in early March. The theme of that workshop was using history to inform movements for justice and public policy. The topic centered on farm labor. And on the third day of the workshop, our guest speaker, a photographer and labor activist, David Bacon, shared some of his photographs from the fields and some oral histories that he did while taking those photos. During this talk, David introduced us to a myriad of farm laborers and stories, but he introduced us to one that struck a chord with us in particular. Her name was Lorena. And Lorena is a field worker from the San Joaquin Valley. And like stories often do, her story stayed with us. So I'm about to share her story with you all, but I also want to just reference our hyperdoc of resources. I believe that it was just shared in the chat. And on the very top of the hyperdoc of resources, you'll find a link to Lorena's story. And feel free to click on that and follow along if you'd like. Before we get into that story, let's spend a few moments viewing two photographs that David Bacon took of Lorena. First is this photograph. It shows Lorena picking blueberries in the San Joaquin Valley. And if you notice the sourcing information, you'll see that Lorena is 20 years old, that she's from Oaxaca, Mexico, and that this photo was taken in 2012. We also want to give you a sense of where Lorena's story takes place and where she works. And so we provided this map to you to give you some geographic sense of where this story is occurring. Now, like I said, Lorena works in the San Joaquin Valley, and in her interviews with David, she mentions the two places that are pinned here, Lamont and Arvin. The second photograph that we want to show you pictures Lorena with her daughter. So what I'm about to read is a transcript of an interview that David Bacon did with Lorena. And as I read this, or as you read it for yourself, pay special attention to how she describes her work experience and her relationship with her daughter. And again, you can follow along by clicking on the Lorena Hernandez oral history link on the hyperdoc resources. Lorena says, you know, to go pick blueberries, I have to get up at 4 in the morning. First, I make my lunch and take it with me, and then I get dressed for work. For lunch, I eat whatever there is in the house, mostly bean tacos. Then the person who gives me a ride to work picks me up at 20 minutes to 5. We call him the raitero, which means ride in Spanish. His name is Rafael, and he comes with his wife. To be honest, I don't know them very well, but they pass by the house to pick me up, and I work as long as my body can take it, usually until 2:30 in the afternoon. They give me a ride home, and I get there by 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. And by then, I'm really tired. My daughter is still asleep when I go to work because we leave so early. We start working at 6 a.m. So I sleep on the way and wake up when we go to the field. There, a contractor gives us our bucket. We wash our hands before picking the fruit. The job isn't that difficult to do. I love seeing the bucket fill up. We know how many we have to fill to have a successful day. And at the end of the day, I'm really tired, but I also think that's because of the heat. They pay $6 a bucket, and each has to weigh 12 pounds. This is the second year I picked blueberries. Since I don't have much experience, I can only do 15 or 16 buckets. Those with more experience can do up to 20 buckets a day. But when the ripe fruit is scarce, I can only pick 13. Depends on how many ripe blueberries the field has. To pick a lot, you have to skip your lunch break. And after a day of picking blueberries, my hands feel tired and dirty and mistreated. Our bodies are hot from working all day, and we immediately wash our hands with cold water. And later, my hands hurt a lot. They don't give us gloves because they say it'll damage the fruit. I've been working since I turned 18, and now I'm 20. I really don't know my daughter anymore, though. She doesn't even call me mama. She calls my aunt mama. She doesn't really understand that I get home tired. She just worries about my aunt, brings her water, and asks her how her day was. My daughter thinks my aunt is her mother. And I understand why my cousins all call my aunt mama, and that's what my daughter hears. My aunt says that she'll understand when she's older. I don't really have a vision of my future yet. I haven't really thought about it. I know I want to work every day. I don't have friends, just acquaintances from work. They don't have responsibilities like I do, so they go out on the weekend. They share their stories with me because since I have a daughter, I don't go out. I just stay home. I wash my daughter's clothes on the weekend because during the week I'm so tired. There isn't time to clean the house during the week either. That's what we do on the weekends. I don't think I'll ever return to school because of my age. My job will be working in the fields. Now, I'd love to go back to school, but it's too late for me. Well, maybe someday. Take a moment to think about Lorena's story. What emotions, thoughts, or questions might you be experiencing? Feel free to share some of those in the chat with the rest of us. And also feel free to scroll through some of the thoughts, questions, or emotions that are being shared. Like I mentioned earlier, Lorena's story struck a chord with us. It stuck with us. And we all sort of realized that food is vital to our identity, it's vital to our traditions, but at what cost? During our Food Connects Us workshop in March, a question was posed to all of us by a historian named Matt Garcia. Matt asked us, how do I make sure that my identity does not come at the expense of someone's dignity? This is obviously a challenging question to answer without quite a bit of thought and investigation. And we believe for this reason, this is a question worthy of a PBL experience that centers issues of social justice. So we're now going to give you a chance to think about that question in another breakout group. Now, the goal here is for you to not have a concrete answer to this complex question, but instead think of an entry point to this question. For example, consider the food that you discussed earlier and its ingredients. Maybe engage in a conversation about where those ingredients come from, who does the labor of picking them, how much you pay for that at the store, etc. The idea now is to help you make sense of this question by first considering its direct application to your life. So again, this breakout group is going to explore the question that was in the chat. How do I make sure that my identity does not come at the expense of someone's dignity?
And once again, as we transition to breakout rooms, let Zoom bring you back when the breakout room ends.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Again, just to reiterate, this is a complex question that you all were attempting to discuss and tackle, to be sure. So something to think about is the sort of scaffold to this question. How would we frame it for students? Well, one scaffold to this question is to have students think about where the food that they identified, where that comes from. My example was tortilla. So my question would be, where's the corn come from? Having students to think about who picks it and what they're paid, right? Those three might be some good entry points for students to tackle this. So we wanted to move forward and thinking about how we each approached this question through the lens of our particular content areas. More specifically, how do we approach Lorena's story and farm laborers through the lenses of history, math, science, ethnic studies, design-based learning? So for this portion of the presentation, we're going to go ahead and elaborate on this by framing the photos and Lorena's story through some conceptual and concrete examples from these subject matter areas. So we're asking you to envision this as a project-based learning opportunity that students in your community are working on, centered on this question: how do I make sure my identity does not come at the expense of someone's dignity? So let's go ahead and start exploring Lorena's story through the lens of history, social studies. And again, the hyper document for resources has links that you can use to pull up some of these pieces that we're referencing. Yeah. So Lorena's story represents a voice that is not captured in textbooks. Typically, the voices of laborers are captured through the voices of labor leaders like Dolores Huerta or Cesar Chavez, and we refer to these stories like Lorena's as counter narratives. Counter narratives challenge traditional narratives. They're not traditionally in textbooks, but they help us better understand the historical perspective of everyday people. In their history classroom, students could explore Lorena Hernandez's story by analyzing using history literacy strategies. Additionally, in history social studies, we talk to teachers about having students develop a historical consciousness by teaching them to think conceptually about the past. We use a framework called the Big 6+1, developed by history educators Peter Satius and Tom Morton, and the UCLA History Geography Project, we're the +1. This conceptual framework that I'm going to introduce you to can be accessed on the HyperDoc of resources. So we want students to understand that Lorena's story is not without context and is not without precedent. Asking students to consider how does Lorena's story and this photo help us contextualize the farm labor movements of the past is a good way for them to practice thinking in terms of continuity and change. How can we make sense of the flows of history? For example, we can point to progress with the short hoe being shown in a picture that's going to show up in the screen. The short hoe is now illegal as of 1975, and this was part of an effort by Chavez, Huerta, and the UFW's campaign during that time. We can also teach students to think critically about the media that they consume. The concept of evidence asks, how do we know what we know about the past? When we ask good questions of media, secondary sources and primary sources, such as this photo of Lorena on the couch with her daughter, we turn them into evidence. For example, a student might analyze this photo, notice the pile of clothes on the couch, and ask a question: do farm laborers in the San Joaquin Valley get paid fair and just wages? And finally, why are we learning this? What is the point? The concept of the activist dimension helps us think about the ways that history can help us work towards equity and justice. Critical project-based learning provides students with the outlet needed to engage this historical thinking concept. How would this same story and these photographs be critically analyzed in a math class? For that, I'm going to go ahead and turn and pass the mic to my colleague, Kristine Ho, who's going to give you that perspective.
Thank you, Danny. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristine Ho. I'm the director of the UCLA Math Project, and I'm honored to be with you tonight as we share how Lorena's story inspired my mathematizing and centering on issues of equity and social justice. Danny just mentioned this idea of evidence from the Big 6+1 framework developed by history educators. I'm going to pick up that idea and make connections to how this can guide mathematizing and humanizing the lives of farm workers like Lorena. Excuse me. Mathematics is a tool in which we can analyze, process, and predict. Immersing myself in Lorena's oral history of her workday and how she strategizes her goals for the number of buckets she needs to pick initiated immediate connections to mathematical ideas. I started to generate a list of mathematical concepts and big ideas that connect her lived story to mathematics. Grade level spans began to emerge, and I therefore focused on identifying math content areas that cut across grade levels. This then led me to begin crafting and connecting specific real-world contexts to help me frame a driving question, really mathematizing her story. But in order to flesh out a driving question, it was necessary to balance the learning goals and how to articulate possible learning objectives. All the while, my goal was to keep Lorena's oral history and situation at the center, focusing on fair wages and how to analyze if and how farm workers are compensated in a way that honors and values their efforts. As I heard more about Lorena's life and the challenges of long workdays and being a young mother, I began to collect possible guiding questions to help formulate a driving question investigating Lorena's story. These questions then led to connecting to current context. For example, how much blueberries sell for at the grocery store? Navigating back and forth between the guiding questions and the real context supported the refinement of a driving question around the cost of blueberries and fair wages. What I just described was the journey I went through as a participant of the History and Geography Project workshop. If this PBL development was in partnership with teachers and students, it would be critical to invite students into the process of generating their own guiding questions to help develop a driving question. This invitation and centering on student curiosity and sense-making is an example of how critical PBL can be a generative, responsive, and transformative way to engage students. I now want to invite John Kovac to give us insight on science learning in this context.
Good evening, everyone. So we're going to build a little bit of what Kristine said about bringing students into this process. And we're going to continue to make connections to Lorena's story through science. So when I attended the UCLA Public History Institute in March, I remember the photographer, David Bacon, asked participants what they were noticing in the pictures, what were their observations. And this really reminded me of a strategy that we use with students to introduce new science concepts, or what we call phenomena. And this photo, this photo by David, which you'll see here in a second, will be the anchor for our storyline and for student learning. And so by really posing these simple questions of what do you see, what do you wonder, we allow students to make a personal connection to the topic and to generate student areas into possible research into the classroom. So what you'll see is a few of the questions that students generated around this picture. Now, these questions will actually allow us to generate a sequence for the learning in this storyline. And what you may be noticing these questions here to my left of the picture, these are some wonderings in the students, and you may notice quite a variety of their interests. And we want to make sure that we honor all questions the students have, but also we want to make it important to frame the learning within science. So when we think of back to Lorena's oral history, she mentioned a few things about working in extreme heat and high temperatures. I'm really tired, but I think that's also because of the heat. Our bodies are hot from working all day. And we can also add research conducted by UC Davis that stated that farm labor is a much different activity. It involves lower level intensity for much longer periods of time in this extreme heat. And also quotes from farmers in California that say heat stress is a dangerous thing, especially for people who are starting to work on the first day of July. So now students know that that blueberry farming is a little bit different work. It typically takes place during the warmer, hotter months of summer. They started wondering why people in the pictures that were harvesting the fruit were wearing long clothing and that cover their bodies when we typically wear less clothing in the summer months. And so that led us to the question to research, this driving question for our thinking: why do farm workers wear so many clothes in the hot sun? So this driving question opens up the opportunity to answer not only students' initial questions, but also new questions through science explorations. We do this, you can see some of these questions here in the middle that kind of tell a story of maybe of how to figure out why are these long clothes? Why are we covered so much in the sun? And then ultimately, how can we keep these farm workers safe in this extreme heat, knowing that climate change the increase in climate change is continuing in California. So we really try to engage students in these science and engineering practices to allow them to uncover those questions, to figure out the anchoring phenomena and the science concepts. So you'll see some of these science and engineering practices to my right, which students will engage in to ultimately figure out the driving questions. And what we know is applications of science often have ethical and social and economical political implications. So students will be able to start to understand the physiological effects of doing field work in the hot sun, and that farm workers are not expendable, that they are a part of our community. And that for scientists, it's very important for them to figure out how to make working conditions safe for those individuals so we can get the food that we eat daily. So here are some of the possible explorations on the next slide that students might be able to perform when engaging in these science explorations. So some of these possible explorations can be framed through a science lens, and they can go beyond the idea of clothing and think of hydration or shade or other ways to reduce daily heat stress the farm workers experience. So if we can go on to the next slide, please.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cindy Mata. I'm the Associate Director at the History Project, and my role today is to make connections to ethnic studies and ethnic studies concepts. So in the content examples provided for history, math, and science, there were several ethnic studies concepts throughout that I feel should be highlighted to show, one, that ethnic studies is interdisciplinary, and two, how ethnic studies can be woven into core content through a project-based learning approach. So the first concept, there we go, is the power of storytelling. So Joanne Archibald defines storytelling as work that educates the heart, mind, body, and spirit, and adds that stories engage listeners and the storyteller in a respectful relationship of reciprocity. And in fact, it was Lorena's story that brought us all together and motivated us to do this work. So the use of storytelling can be an engaging way to center counter narratives that help develop empathy, but it can also lead to the inquiry process, as the previous examples showed. The next concept is humanizing pedagogy. And humanizing pedagogy is teaching that respects and uses the reality, history, and perspectives of students as an integral part of the education process. This pedagogy positions students as knowers and as active participants in their learning. So by pairing storytelling with project-based learning, this is one way of engaging in humanizing pedagogies. The initial question posed by our historian was an attempt to humanize the content. Through his question, which you see on the screen, he puts us in direct conversation with Lorena and her life, and reminds us that we are in community, in relation with one another, even if that's not always at the forefront of our thinking. Additionally, I want to highlight some of the follow-up questions that young folks asked as they heard about Lorena's story, right? In science, we heard, is this work dangerous work? And through conversations with the math project, I heard a young person asking, does her daughter understand that Lorena is her mother? So through their initial inquiries, we see that students are concerned about Lorena's well-being, and thus proving that this humanizing approach can lead to further content exploration that holds cariño and respeto, or care and respect, as the core to any future exploration. And the last concept is critical consciousness, or concentración. And this is a popular education concept developed by Paulo Freire. It focuses on achieving an in-depth understanding of the world that includes taking action against the oppressive elements in one's life that are illuminated by said understanding. And these understandings can be illuminated by asking questions, right? And so again, pairing Lorena's story with elements of project-based learning helps build students' critical consciousness, as it gives students an opportunity to answer some of the questions that drove their study or inquiry, like, is this work dangerous work? But it also holds space for students to sit with questions that are more difficult to answer, like the second question that we were posed, or the question of, does Lorena's daughter understand that Lorena is her mother? So these are concepts that ground ethnic studies work, and by being intentional in positioning these concepts at the center of our inquiry process, we can move towards a more critical approach to project-based learning. And now I'm gonna hand it off to my colleague, Jessica, who will take these content examples and magnify them through a framework process.
Thank you, Cindy. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Heim, and I'm the director of the Design-Based Learning Project at UCLA Center X. And I'm so happy to be part of this conversation today about how we reimagine interdisciplinary planning. My work at UCLA is focused on the Doreen Nelson method of design-based learning, and I hope that the framework the methodology uses to deliver the required content might be a way to bring all of the previous content connections together to give you a delivery system for this required content and also incorporate civics. In this student-centered pedagogy, the spatial domain is activated first, and this is done through having students design and build 3D, never before seen artifacts before any subject matter is taught. By doing this, students are immediately engaged in the higher level thinking skills that are associated with creativity and innovation, and also transfer of learning from the very beginning. Using the 6.5 steps of backwards planning that you see in the top right corner, design challenges are presented by first defining a problem and identifying an essential question and design challenge based on curriculum related big topics. Then students begin to design and build their never before seen 3D artifacts, including the Hallmark Design Challenge, which is a student built miniature starter city of the future. And this is part of a story driven curriculum based sequence throughout the entire school year. The storytelling creates opportunities for engagement, and teachers are able to connect their subject matter and civics through guided lessons that connect back to the 3D designs. So in short, our methodology kind of flips the learning process around so that creativity is upfront to sneak up on the learning and provide a context for doing so. You can see the content connections below the design challenge of the starter city that align with what you heard from the history, geography, math, and science projects. So you can see how a lot of that content can be connected to the design challenge. And then in the left-hand column, you see a civics channel. Within the context of the student build city, students get to role play jobs and govern their city while actively learning civics through a social justice lens within the walls of their classroom. And this is where I want to focus with my connections to the DBL project. As I listened to Lorena's oral history and really reflected on it and connected my work in the design-based learning project, I was really struck by thinking about how a democratic classroom structure can help foster more socially responsible, critically conscious students and create equitable outcomes, not only in the classroom, but in the community over time. Within the context of a real location where Lorena Hernandez lives in the San Joaquin Valley, you can see that map in front of you, students would collaborate to each build a small piece of a never before seen 3D starter city, following a criteria list to ensure that all of the elements of a city or a community are incorporated. Then, as part of their learning process, in addition to connecting content through guided lessons, students would govern their city and learn civics through a series of student-led council district and city meetings. Students are divided up into council districts that you see in front of you to identify and discuss problems, do research, and collaborate in small groups, and then make decisions and equitable solutions in whole group city meetings. And this is to ensure that all inhabitants of their starter city have their needs met. Using the student-centered approach really humanizes complex ideas and issues and policies and gives students a safe and supportive environment to have powerful conversations, to learn how to use their voices and advocate for their own needs, also engage in thoughtful debates, learn to ask and answer questions, all within the walls of their classroom. Connecting back to Lorena's lived story, again, some of the possible topics of discussion and decision-making could be focused around equitable living conditions, fair wages, food prices, labor unions, access to childcare and education, mental health solutions, and also transportation within the city. Students could come up with more ideas and connections as well to give them the space and tools to really reimagine and dream of innovative, never before seen solutions to these real world problems, promoting more critically conscious adults and change makers that take action in their own communities over time. And in all of our work towards equity and social justice, a vital element is creating and supporting, creating environments and supporting young students in self-expression and the ability to use their voices by creating these spaces. So now I will pass it back to Cindy, who's going to make some more connections to ethnic studies, correct?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you so much. And so if we could go on to the next slide. So in working with Jessica, we talked about ways in which our work mirrors and expands our ideas around inquiry and research. DBL has students engage in inquiry research in the safety of their classroom, which I feel is a great scaffold for YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, which is a common research framework used in ethnic studies courses, where students are asked to go beyond the walls of the classroom and engage in work that has a broader community and societal reach. Aligned with humanizing pedagogy, YPAR redefines who has the expertise to produce knowledge and centers young people as researchers who are living the issues they are studying. Much like the content examples, YPAR asks students to define and investigate an issue or problem with the added component of taking action. With the last step, YPAR promotes young people's social political development, their critical consciousness, so that they understand the roots of the problem facing their communities and have the skills and motivation to take action. I did put a link to YPAR related content in the hyperdoc for you all. One piece that I would now add to the YPAR process after learning about DBL is holding a space for a design challenge in the form of freedom dreaming at the beginning before students begin their investigative work. I feel this would give students an opportunity to practice freedom dreaming, what a solution might look like prior to engaging in their research. So freedom dreaming, as defined by Bettina Love, are dreams grounded in a critique of injustice. These dreams are critical and imaginative dreams of collective resistance. Though the term is being reintroduced presently, the idea of freedom dreaming towards liberation and social justice is not new. Robin Kelly, author of Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, stated in 2002 that any revolution must begin with thought, with how we imagine a new world, with how we construct our social and individual relationships, with unleashing our desires and unfolding a new future on the basis of love and creativity rather than rationality. And public intellectual Adrienne Marie Brown adds that all social justice work is science fiction. We are imagining a world free of injustice, a world that does not exist yet. So as we engage in inquiry and research, I am also asking for us to leave room for dreaming and imagining new possibilities first. And I know we've thrown a lot at y'all, and I know we're getting close to the end, but we want to give y'all a moment to think through what is resonating with you at the moment. We will stay on for a little bit longer to extend the Q&A portion. If you want to type in the chat what's resonating with you. And again, remember that the hyperdoc has also just been dropped again in our chat.
If anyone does have questions, you can either raise your virtual hand or unmute yourself and just ask.
Thank you, Gentine. We see that. Well, we all are really appreciative of you joining us today. We hope that at the least this was thought-provoking. If you're curious to learn more about the center or about our individual projects or the other projects that are housed at Center X, there's a link on the hyperdoc of resources that can take you to that. Thank you so much. That can take you to our web pages, our social media accounts as well. So again, feel free to stick around for a couple of minutes. If you want to ask any questions of us, feel free to ask those in the chat. But on behalf of the team, we all want to thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Hey, great work as usual. Really appreciative of all this and the frameworks that you're interweaving, because a lot of times they get, they're on their own. Like YPAR might be done in one site, and then DBL in another. So you're really doing great work in interconnecting these as like a critical ecology of praxis. So that's super important and much needed. One thing, I'm thinking about in my own practice with my students trying to do this work, how are students how are they responding to this? What are the stories of the students as they do the work, engage the work, and kind of their developmental trajectory, like throughout, because they come into the classroom, they start to do these projects, and by the end of it, a lot's gone on, and it's got their brains firing. It can be transformative for them. So are you recording these experiences in different ways and looking at that qualitative data, and then assessing what are the benefits that I'm sure are part of the large body of research that substantiates all this? Are you finding any other outcomes as a result of this interlinking approach, which I don't recall seeing research on this, approach and its outcomes. So.
There's probably a reason for that. It's either it's probably because that work is being done in small pockets by teachers in different schools, but the kind of way that we framed it is based on an idea that was sparked by Matt Garcia's talk and the question, and by the story that David shared with us, and it prompted us, John with the science project, Kristine with math, and Jessica to all get together and start thinking about, like, what would a project-based learning framework that centered these issues look like? How might it be different? And so what we're sharing with you are sort of the product of all of these conversations and idea exchanges. It's as something that we're really interested in exploring, in collaborating here at the center. But as of yet, we don't at Center X have any data on what this looks like when it's executed for a community or a school district.
I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to say this was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm new to PBL, and what you just demonstrated put it into perspective for me and in a very meaningful context. My question is, I teach kindergarten, and I've not done any training prior to this workshop, to this webinar on PBL. So I'm wondering if you have any recommendations about where I can begin so that I can begin the work with my kindergartners.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I was just going to answer your question. So we do provide some trainings through Center X. We have one coming up at the end of July. That's an introduction to design-based learning interactive workshop where we really take participants through the design challenges. And it's an interactive experience where we teach you the tools and strategies to start this in your classroom. We also help support with interdisciplinary planning in K through 12 classrooms.
Perfect, thank you.
Of course, yes. And you can find information in that hyperdoc as well, and it will link you to our website to find out more.
Thanks for all of the presentations. I was thinking about a question about implementing design-based or project-based learning, thinking about Lorena and your question, Danny, about trying to find entry points to answering this broader question. I'm just asking, kind of as a rule, is it helpful to kind of go through this yourself in the design phase before implementing it with students? My small group got caught up on being like a critical consumer and kind of like, what are the steps that I could take as an individual And so thinking about how much research potentially and experience I need to do before I would feel comfortable leading students through a similar experience. So just thinking about a rule of thumb.
Yeah, you know what? I think what was helpful for us in this process was we all kind of met together and we were just like, well, what did we get out of that story? So like John talked about it from a science perspective, and Jen and Kristine talked about it from a math perspective. So I think like, just like as a generative process, like if you're going to try and do this with educators, like as an interdisciplinary approach, maybe just starting off the conversation of like, what's coming up for you all individually. And what was really cool about that process is through there, we were able to see like, cool, like it's storytelling that's grounding everyone's interest and motivation. The different parts of it will come, you know, from the content-based approach, but at the heart of it was the storytelling and the humanizing component of like what that does, right? So I think like that would be a really great first step, because that just helps. It helped me see Lorenas Story in ways that I didn't come at it originally.
Less important about the final outcome, you know, like what we can do within this, you know, as a critical consumer within the, you know, our thinking about Lorena, but more about the humanizing component, and that as a mindset to cultivate within our students. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing, adding on to what Cindy said, that I think this back and forth is so important. You know, for me, when I heard her story, I immediately started to think about so many different things, but it wasn't until I was able to talk through that with others. And if I could have done it with kids and teachers, I would want to hear their perspective. I actually was able to share it with my own children, and hearing what concerned them around what they heard was so enlightening, and also really helped us, like you talked about, this humanizing part of it. I think that's so critical. So I would think there isn't necessarily a rule of thumb, other than I think hearing from all parties is really critical. It's about processing it for yourself. It's about processing it with students and other colleagues, you know, and this back and forth. And not that there's always only one direction, but it's just checking in and hearing other people's voices, because their lens is going to help you think more critically about it.
Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. Congratulations. I'm so happy to meet all of you. Jessica has told me so much about the work that you do and how you collaborate together. And I have really good feelings about the possibilities that you can accomplish by working together in this way. I've been slugging away on this issue for 40 years and never had a group of people like you who are willing to talk to me and work with me collaboratively. I think you're going to accomplish a lot, and congratulations. This was a fascinating beginning. Danny, you were terrific, a moderator, and enjoyed all of you. It was a wonderful presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you, Doreen. Doreen's our founding director of design-based learning, if you didn't know, and she created this methodology many years ago, seeing, you know, a gap in education, and she's supporting us at UCLA as well.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.